Well, Steve Green, thank you very much, and Chris Clark, thank you for the great job you do in leading the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. And to all of you here on this rainy, nasty morning, thank you for coming out. You honor me by listening to the words that I'll share with you today. You know, in my 32 years of public life, I've had the opportunity to serve with Nathan Deal, with Casey Cagle, and with David Ralston. In my service with them, I know them to be great, honorable, dedicated Georgians. And I can tell you as one that has a perspective from Washington, no state in our great union has better elected leadership as governor, lieutenant governor, and Speaker of the House than we have in Georgia. They deserve a big round of applause. I also do a lot of work with municipal and county leadership and really from around the country because of some of the committee services I have had. And no city and no state with a capital city is more fortunate in this country to have a mayor like Kasim Reed than we are. He is a great mayor for Georgia and a great mayor for Atlanta and a great partner with all of us in the projects we work towards in our future. Give him a big round of applause. To all the members of the General Assembly, I spent 17 years of my life in the Georgia House and the Georgia Senate. I know the time you spend, the dedication you have, and from me personally, thank you for your service to this state. Because as Nathan knows, and as Casey knows, and as David knows, and as I know, successful political leadership is a partnership with all that govern, not just one that governs. And our great legislature has the chance to do many great things this year to improve the plight of our state. In fact, it's our legislature and our elected leadership that make Georgia different than any other state in the union. You might say, well, what do you mean by that? I want you to think about it. If you think about Georgia, you think about the rest of the country, there are two things that set us apart from any other state in the union. Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport and the Port of Savannah. Neither one of which would exist today were it not for a great partnership between our cities, our counties, our state, and our federal government. And to that end, that's the first subject I want to talk about today, and that's the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project, better known as SHEP. As we move closer and closer towards deepening our water port, expanding our port, and being able to welcome the Panamax ships of the 20th century into our harbor in Savannah. I have worked since I've been in Congress. In fact, when I came to Congress in 1999 was when the authorization for the expansion of the Savannah Harbor first passed. It passed as a $220 million authorization to expand and deepen that harbor. In the 14 years since I was elected to Congress, we've seen many trials and tribulations on the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project. Everything from blunt-nosed sturgeons and a fish ladder we're going to build in Augusta, Georgia, to concerns about oxygenation, to concerns of our bordering states about whether it would be in their best interest if they let Georgia, in fact, expand its port. But we're this close to the reality. And I want to give you step-by-step where we are. In October, Joe Ellen Darcy, Corps of Engineers and the head of this project, signed off on the record of decision, which basically means the United States government in its entirety, every agency with authority, and there are a lot of them, have all signed off on the expansion project. We have one project partnership agreement left to be signed, and all the paperwork will have been done. We have one last hurdle, and it's called a 902. You know, in Washington, if you don't do these numbers and you don't use acronyms, you can't talk. And 902 doesn't mean anything to anybody in this room, but it's a critical step we must make. In 1986, the Water Resources Development Act, passed by Congress, put a requirement on the Corps of Engineers that in any project they took on, if its funding level required a 20% increase over its original authorization, it had to go back to Congress for an approval of the additional money. The original authorization in 1999 for the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project was $220 million. Its estimated cost today, 14 years later, is $668 million. More than a 20% increase, so we have to go in for a 902 approval, which we'll be working on either through the Water Resources Development Act, if we do one this year, or through the White House. And this is where I want to bring Kasim Reed in. We would not be where we are today with the administration in Washington on the Savannah Harbor project were it not for Kasim Reed. He has traveled from Atlanta on many occasions to Washington and will be coming back this coming week to work on that project. And we are hoping and have our fingers crossed that when the president's budget comes out in the next 18 days, it will have an earmark, not an illegal earmark, but a legal earmark, for the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project and a 902 authorization to give us the way to move forward. And Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, the great senator from that state, has already included a placeholder in this year's appropriation at $3 million to hold the Savannah Project funding line in place. So we're this close. We're not there yet, but we're rounding third base and we're getting ready to slide into home. And with God's help and the coordinated leadership between Governor Deal, Casey Cagle, David Ralston, Kasim Reed, those of us in the Congress of the United States, and Mayor Kasim Reed, we're going to see to it the Savannah Project is a reality. And let me give you one good reason why that's so important. When you do a project like this, before the record of decision is signed off by the Corps of Engineers, they have to do a cost-benefit study analysis to determine whether or not the federal money invested is going to have a benefit to the United States of America, not just the state of Georgia. The payback on the Savannah Project for our country is $5.50 for every dollar invested. It's going to generate $174 million in revenue for the United States government. It is a great project, it is a great port, and we are committed to seeing its reality and come to fruition as an expanded port to take the Panamax ships of the 21st century. And I thank the governor, lieutenant governor, the speaker, and I thank the mayor for their coordinated work on this effort. And I thank the chamber for never, ever dying in its support. Steve Green has been fantastic, the Ports Authority has been great, and Chris and the chamber board have been unaltering in their support for what we have tried to do in Washington. Speaking of Washington, I don't think you stand before 2,000 of your citizens in your state and not address what is now a mess in Washington, D.C. We have found ways to kick the can down the road and put off making difficult decisions until we no longer can put them off anymore. We're going to have to sit down and we're going to have to do what American people have to do. We have to do what the state legislatures had to do for 5 successive years, sit around our kitchen table, prioritize our spending, and get our spending in line with our income. Washington spends too much money. Washington borrows too much money, and we no longer have the luxury of continuing to do it. Washington is now basically at zero leverage, meaning we are 100% leveraged. We have a debt of $16,471 billion and a GDP of the same amount. So we are basically totally leveraged. I was a real estate guy for 33 years. I understand leverage. Leverage makes real estate work, and too much leverage kills it. Well, our country's at the point where we're going to go from understanding compound interest as a benefit to learning about what compound debt is like. Because when you go over that cliff, when you are borrowing more than you're taking in, and the interest you pay on that debt compounds, it escalates and it accentuates and it raises your liability. It doesn't reduce it. So we've got to do some very tough things. Now, the first thing I want to discuss is the fiscal cliff bill, which passed at 2:30 in the morning on January 1st of this year. As you all know, at midnight, December 31st, all tax rates in the country went up by a total of over $4 trillion. At 2:30 in the morning, we finally reached an agreement in the Senate and passed by a substantial margin a bill that did the following things. First of all, it saved $3.7 trillion of that $4.3 trillion tax increase for the American taxpayer. It took all marginal rates below $400,000 and $450,000 and froze them and made them permanent. Since 2001, nobody's known what their taxes were going to be the next year because we had all these sunsets where the tax rates were always going to sunset and revert back to another time. We don't have that anymore. Your tax rates are now locked at the marginal rate in the law and cannot change unless an act of Congress changes them. No more arbitrary substitutes, no more arbitrary deadlines, no more arbitrary sunsets. We finally, for Georgia's farmers and for Georgia's small business people, we finally dealt with the death tax. We made permanent the death tax exemption at $5 million for an individual and $10 million for a couple, and indexed it forever to inflation. We locked the tax in at 40%, not at 55%, and we made that permanent as well. For dividends and for capital gains, we continued to pair them equally at 15% on capital gains and dividends below $400,000 and $450,000 in income, 20% above that amount, and we made that permanent. And for the AMT, which is an evil treatment of taxation which passed in 1968 to tax the 11 millionaires who didn't pay any taxes in 1966, is now covering so many million Americans, including a lot of people in this room. We fixed the AMT and are keeping it from going into effect on 30 million American taxpayers. So while it was not a perfect transaction, it was not a perfect deal, we put the revenue issue aside, and now Congress has to go forward and face the bigger issue of spending, the bigger issue of borrowing, and the bigger issue of debt. In the next 60 to 90 days, 3 cliffs stand before us. But they're not the cliffs like the one we had on taxes. That was an imposed cliff by the Budget Reconciliation Act of 2011. These cliffs are cliffs of reality. First, at some point in time in February, we will reach the current federal debt ceiling. And the United States of America's debt has to be approved by Congress to be raised. There are people who will tell you on talk shows, and some people who will tell you esoterically that we don't have to do it, but we do have to do it. To borrow, the United States has to have the authority of the Congress to raise the debt ceiling in the country, and that will come to Congress. Second thing that's going to happen is automatic sequestration goes in place March the 1st. That's a $1.2 trillion automatic across-the-board cut in all discretionary spending over the next 10 years. That's about a 10% cut a year for 10 years in federal spending, and across the board, not on a cost-benefit analysis, which I'll get back to in a minute. And then the third thing that happens on March the 27th. The current continuing resolution under which the United States government is appropriating and operating sunsets and has to be reauthorized to get us through the end of the year. These are not things you can put off. These are not things that we can avoid. These are things we have to deal with. And it's my hope as a representative of each of you that we recognize the reality of bringing to light spending, borrowing, debt, and authorizations, and try and work out a deal to send the message to our American people that we're going to get our arms around discretionary federal spending, that we're going to make the tough decisions we have to make to be sure this country remains the strongest economic power in the world. I've told you our debt scenario, about $16 trillion to $16 trillion in terms of debt and GDP. But let me tell you how you get to reducing your debt and your deficit in this country. A lot of people think you can do it by cutting discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is $1.2 trillion. Actually, it was $1.182 trillion last year. Our deficit was $1.2 trillion. So you couldn't even balance the budget if you cut out the entire federal government. Discretionary spending is a part of the problem, but it's not the total problem. The bigger problem is what's known as entitlements and benefits that are on cruise control and automatically appropriated. We spend $1.2 trillion in discretionary spending. We spend $2.5 trillion in mandatory spending. You cannot get your arms around your debt and your increasing deficit unless you get into some very difficult subjects like entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, SSI disability, federal retirement, state retirement, and the like. And we've got to face those, and as a member of the Finance Committee, I stand ready to take the chance to make the difficult decisions to make it right for America in the long run. And without going too long, I want to be specific. You have paid for your Social Security all your life. You've paid 6.2% of your income this year up to $113,000 for your payroll tax, and your employer has matched it. You have earned that benefit. That's not an entitlement somebody's granted you. It's a contract with you and your government. Medicare is the same. You've paid 1.35% of your income regardless of what it was for your Medicare benefit, and you deserve that Medicare benefit to be protected. And your grandchildren and children deserve for us to see to it it's there for them too. But we cannot do that without reforming the benefit for the eligibility of the time. You have to protect those and the benefits for those that are on it, and then reform the program to preserve it for those in the future. In Social Security, it is a relatively easy fix, relatively, and I underline that word. In 1983, when I was 39 years old, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill found out Social Security was going broke in 2011, 2 years ago. They got to the White House and Tip said to Ronnie, "We got to fix this, Ronnie." And Ronnie said, "We're going to fix it, but we're not going to raise the tax." And Tip said, "Well, I'm willing to fix it, but we're not going to cut the benefit." And they looked over at the actuary in the corner and they said, "What do we do?" And the actuary said, "Well, you reform eligibility." So in 1983, they changed eligibility for Social Security and changed the law by saying if you were born after 1943, you no longer are eligible for Social Security at age 65. You have to wait till 66. I was born in 44. They took away 1 year of my eligibility. Did I miss it? No, my father told me it was going to be there anyway. And at 39, I didn't think I was going to live to 65 anyway. I'm now 68 and enjoying the benefits, but I lost a year. But we saved the program until now, and once again now it's on a collision course to go broke again. We've got to see to it we protect it for those children and grandchildren of ours. So we're going to have to push that eligibility out again. It goes to 67 in a couple of years. For my children, it may need to be 68. For my grandchildren, it may need to be 69. But their life expectancies are longer, their working productive years are longer, and they won't miss it. But we'll save the program not just for those who have it today as they know it, but for those who should expect to have it because it's a contract between the country and the taxpayer, and we cannot give away a contract, period. Secondly, on Medicare, it's a tougher decision. It's the 800-pound gorilla. It's where most of the spending is. And we're going to have to reform it, but we're going to have to save it for the Americans who have paid for it, which is every American that's ever taken a paycheck. Although there was a lot of criticism of premium support versus fee-for-service reimbursement, in fact, that's probably the way we have to go to quantify our expense as a government. We probably have to apply some means test to benefits. We already means test the premium. We probably ought to means test the benefit. But find a way to preserve Medicare not just for the next week, but for the next decade and the decades to come. It's going to take some tough decisions, but looking the other way and not making that decision will continue to go in deeper debt, and our country will never be as strong as it's been in the past. In fact, we'll be weaker, and we will have weakened ourselves. And we also need to look at the American business community as the example of what our government ought to do. There's not a company in here probably that still has a defined contribution plan. If there is, they're in the minority. Because American business went from, defined benefit plan. American business went from defined benefit to defined contribution to get their pension problems in order. We probably ought to look at the same thing in the federal government. You can't invalidate an existing defined benefit program because it's a contract and the courts have ruled on that. But for future employees coming into the company, go to defined contribution instead of defined benefit. You make them a partner in saving for their future. You also can capitate the contribution that you're making, and you can better control your cost. And then go through every other benefit that's on cruise control, from food stamps to AFDC and everything else in between, and make sure the eligibility is handled right, make sure the program hasn't gotten out of hand, make sure we're running those benefit programs like a business. We always want a safety net, but we always want to be a job to be preferable to the safety net. We've gotten close in this country to providing a safety net that made people comfortable enough to wait a little bit longer before they went back to work, and we don't need to do that anymore. We need to see to it that a job is always preferable to a benefit, and that's what makes our country great. So my message to you today from Washington is very simple. We have some difficult problems ahead, and most of them are our own making. We're going to have to make some difficult decisions, but you've already had to as a businessman or a businesswoman. Our state has cut billions in the last 5 years from what it's spending because of the downsizing in the economy, and in some measure because of the increase in federal programs the state participates in. In Georgia, we don't have the luxury of being able to borrow. Constitutionally, we can't borrow to spend. We have to spend within our means. Washington needs to change the way it works, balance its budget, and put some restraints on ourselves like restraints that are on the state of Georgia. And when we do, we'll be a better country, just like Georgia is a better state. So on behalf of all the congressional delegation, but particularly on behalf of myself, thanks to all of you for what you do to make this country great and this state great. Thanks to our elected leadership for the contribution they make. And most importantly of all, let's continue to hope that God will bless the United States of America as the greatest country on the face of this earth. God bless you, and thank you very much.